All right, welcome back. We are still in chapter 3, now on part 2. This, I think, is probably one of my favorite chapters of all in the text, just because it gives so much insight. And like I said, from the first part of it, so much of it just makes sense. It's literally relatable. You can see yourself in it, you can see the people around you. And I have so many stories. Like, we'd be here all day if I could give a story for everyone. Okay, so we covered in part 1 how we judge our social worlds. We already went through the numerous constructs that tell us essentially that we operate on two systems, and system 1 is the one that's automatic and unconscious. Essentially, the research shows that we are informed by these implicit rules that guide our snap judgments and by our moods. Now, what else? Well, perception of our social worlds. We perceive and recall events through filters of our assumptions. We explain events by sometimes attributing them to the situation, but most times we attribute to the person. And yes, our social beliefs are super influential. We expect certain events, thereby sometimes helping to bring them out. So, what we expect is what we get. And we'll go through the details of that coming. Okay, so did you realize that the first impressions are pretty accurate? Now, I don't want you to think for a moment that this means that you don't need to get to know others or that this is going to be foolproof, because there are occasions when the first impression is wrong. But you should know that most times that first impression that you get, that first thought or feeling, you can actually give some credence, some weight to it. PM remains confident of second term. This is taken from a news clipping posted August 12th, 2019. Royston Jones Jr. was the one who wrote this article. And it doesn't matter when this headline is posted, it would be accurate of Prime Minister Minnis. And in this instance, as long as we are referring to Hubert Minnis as Prime Minister, then that means that this particular thought that the FNM is going to be successful in a second term would be completely false if we were to interview Brave Davis, Chester Cooper, or any of the individuals in the PLP constituents, or even if we extend a little further and go to, let's say, the DNA. Like our personal impressions of others, political perceptions are very much in the eye of the beholder. Who will win the next election is going to differ depending on who you ask. And funny enough, this line of thinking also remains true of sports fans, their perceptions of their teams, as well as the perceptions of the referees. Because the referee that is, if it's home court advantage, then if you are the other team who's not the home team, then the referees are likely to be cheating and unfair and against your team. And the true would be same for the reverse scenario. The other time we find that this is true in terms of where perceptions are going to differ is with media bias. So we may feel that a particular news paper or a particular news station is, if it's owned by or affiliated with a political party, or like in the US with the Democrats versus the conservatives, then you will be less trusting of, for example, CNN versus MSNBC. Belief perseverance is what happens when, regardless of how many facts are given to discredit a piece of information, the person does not change his or her mind on the information that they have already accepted as being true. We have probably all experienced it. I think the best one for me is convincing older people in my life that when my children walk around barefoot in my house in the Bahamas, that this does not make them sick. In fact, I'll go as far as to challenge that neither does draft or getting wet in the rain, because essentially germs make us sick. But I can go through every biological explanation, as I've done before, and I can still get row if somebody who cares about us walks in and find that my children, particularly when they were younger, were walking around our tiled floor barefoot. The fascinating research, and this is belief perseverance. The fascinating research that is described in your text helps us to see that even in laboratory settings, this is true. As the authors put it, beliefs can grow their own legs and survive discrediting. And belief perseverance is how we can really explain how fake news so easily becomes truth. So now, we have, I think, as of 2018 and the Trump, we all understand what quote unquote fake news means. And, in the Bahamas, we may not necessarily have our version of Trump, and the war against the media as has played out with the U.S. politics in since his administration came in. But we do have WhatsApp, and we do have the tons of WhatsApp videos that are created and are purported as truth when they are many times sensationalized, drawn out of proportion, or just really lies that because it is seen, it is passed on enough times, it comes to be belief as truth. Now, just so that you know, belief perseverance is really your initial conceptions. This is what you thought explains, or this is what you understand to be true. You hold on to that. People get sick when they go out in the rain. And so somebody comes to you and they go out in the rain and they came in from out of the rain and you row it and you're like, you could get sick. And the person says, no, I'm not going to get sick because I also get wet when I'm in the shower and I don't get sick. I also have gotten wet when I go in the pool or on the beach, and I have clothes on when I'm on the beach and I don't get sick. I also have gotten wet in the rain before and did not get sick. And then you may attempt to explain that water coming into contact with one's body does not make one sick, blah, 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 blah. And it is still not believed because they're holding so tight to what their first piece of information was or whatever they deem to be the truth. Okay, so we had this statement to consider on day one when you would have done the pretest, but in case you're listening to it and we did not do the pretest this semester or you weren't present for the pretest, the statement goes as follows. Memory can be likened to a storage chest in the brain into which we deposit material and from which we can withdraw it later if needed. Occasionally, something is lost from the chest, and then we say, we have forgotten. For most of us, we believe that this statement is true, but it really is false. Our memory banks are constructed and edited every single time we recall and share. Thus, we can, and we do easily, although it is primarily unconsciously, revise our memories to suit our current knowledge. Given that this is the case, you shouldn't be surprised at the next concept to be discussed, which is the misinformation effect. Essentially, this occurs when unrelated information is incorporated into our memory about an event. I should note that while we all do it, it is usually never the intent. So when we talk about misinformation effect, if you're going to use this as one to write up, you're not talking about the person who intentionally is adding false information, who is intentionally making the story more salacious so that it passes. No, that's just a liar. What I'm talking about is the ease with which small cues that we may not be aware of that or common conversations seep into. And so when we recall information, we include the newer pieces of information and add it all into that. And so we walk away thinking that all of that was gotten at the same time, that was in our memory without realizing that was something that was added post the experience. So this is usually because of our social worlds. Someone says something, adds a piece of information, you see something, you interact with somebody else, and voila, all of a sudden, it's not Dr. Jones wearing a purple pants on the first day of school, but it is Dr. Jones wearing red pants with red heels. And even though it's very simple it's those small details that make drastic differences, particularly for those of you who are law and criminal majors, when you are looking at eyewitness reports and even just testimonies and going based off of memories in order to make cases for the conviction or release of an individual. So, how else do we see the construction of memories playing out? The best is that we downplay the bad that we have seen or thought or experienced when we recall details about a situation, um, especially in instances where we've had a change of heart. So, let's say that my husband was a part of a group that was responsible for me having a hellish experience in high school. True story, he and I went to high school together, but the rest is not true. So now, let's say my husband and I, we reconnect in our 30s. We fall in love. For a moment, I didn't even realize he was who he was. Um, so we get married. We have a couple babies. And all of a sudden, I have a hard time remembering the awful things that was done to me in high school that may have been done by him and or the group members, the members of the group that he was a part of. They're less horrible. Maybe I was just being, super sensitive because I was a teenager. Maybe I was insecure, so I was blowing things out of proportion. I'm going to explain it away. I'm going to downplay it because surely the man that I have currently said that I love and I'm committed to, that's the best thing since sliced bread for me. Surely he could not have been so horrible, or that could not have been that bad. This also happens with events. So while in New York for a 2-week conference in summer 2017, it was a good time. It was New York. It was a conference. I had sessions every day for 7 of the working days within that 2-week spans. And it was all right. Now, 3, 4, 5 years later, maybe, and I don't even remember the times that I was just thoroughly disgusted at the dirt, just fatigued at the long walks in the heat. I also don't remember how overwhelmed I was at the crowds, and even how boring some days of those conferences was. All I remember is that I was in New York and it was big lights and it was so amazing. This is an example of rosy retrospection. We also see this playing out, how we construct our memories of ourselves and our worlds. We see it and how we recall past behaviors. So not just only past experiences, would be the rosy retrospection, but again, at the end of the day, if we go back to chapter 2, we have to be able to live with ourselves. We have to maintain a sense of self. So I have to walk away feeling pretty, I can't feel like I'm a completely horrible person. So in order to do that, we then now have to quote unquote forget or downplay the bad parts, the things that I may have done. So again, maybe, I really was a horrible teenager. Like nobody liked me. My parents barely tolerated me. I, got kicked out. And, I'm maybe telling stories a couple years later. Life has changed. I'm in a completely different position. The things that I would have done when I was in high school just is completely inappropriate for the class, social settings, storytelling. And so I downplay and I say, yeah, I had a rough teenage life, I never admit that I was the bully, that I got kicked out of school. But, I would just talk about how I had challenges fitting in and, was just overwhelmed at it all. And so that led to me having to go to a couple of schools, but, small stuff. So it's the downplaying. And we downplay enough and we actually rewrite our memory. And so you will, quote unquote, forget. You will. So it's not people again lying. It's not people intentionally avoiding. You will forget. So how do we explain our social worlds? There's 2 scenarios at play here. We make sense of others and their behaviors by either blaming them or we blame the situation. So now this is a controversial, yet it's cliche topic that we continue to seek to explain. I'm going to use this example when we look at person versus situation for attributing causality. So let's talk about the pregnant teen. I know I said cliche, potentially controversial. So if you are team, she's pregnant because she fasts, no manners, and like grown man, then you are taking the team of situation. So this is the dispositional, sorry, not situation. This is the dispositional attribution perspective. So this is all about the person. If on the other hand, you are team, this teenager is pregnant because she was constantly unsupervised, both parents were absent from her life or in and out, she was abused from her extended family, then you are on the team of situational attribution. And you are seeking to help understand, explain the current scenario, which is a 15-year-old being pregnant, by not attributing it to her or qualities about her, but looking at the wider context of the situation. So this is weird for most of us until it's explained, and then I think it makes a little more sense. But when we are making sense of others, we jump to, like, there's in 2019 there's a colloquial kind of pop culture reference that says don't come for me. So we come after people. So when we're trying to make sense of them, we are looking at and blaming and assessing them based on their characters, their personality, their traits. So much so that in the research that's described in the text, when given the sentence about the librarian, so you'd have to reference the text to know what I'm talking about, rather than us recalling the actions or specifics from the sentence, we summarize that the librarian was helpful. Actually, the example here, it's now on the screen. The librarian carries the old woman's groceries across the street. So in the research that was done, they found that people summarized the librarian as being helpful rather than actually remembering what the librarian did. And this is spontaneous trait inference. And this is, again, going back to us having to kind of make sense of our world and do it quickly. When we are understanding, when we're trying to make sense of someone's behavior, we don't need to keep all of the details in place. We just kind of find a characteristic that's going to summarize and we go with that. The next way that we understand how we explain our social worlds, particularly as it relates to attributing causality, is the fundamental attribution error. I usually refer to it as FAE because it sometimes is a mouthful. So if you hear me say FAE, I'm referring to fundamental attribution error. And what we have learned is that our environment impacts our actions more than we tend to give credit to. FAE occurs when we underestimate the impact of the environment, the situation to the behavior of someone. So we see the end result. So person, bank lane, in handcuffs, somebody, the person who's murdered in a fight, the person, the pregnant teen, and we naturally assume that they are bad. That's a bad person, rather than us seeking to understand the context within which their choices were made. So, fundamental attribution error. Again, this is where we look at someone and their behavior, their current situation, and the way that we explain it is by downplaying, like significantly downplaying the context, but ascribing their behavior, their condition to who they are. It is something about that person. Okay. So more time is we spend on understanding FAE because it helps to reveal how we think about ourselves and others, but also really it illuminates how environmental causes are often the root of people's failures, disabilities, and misfortune. Fundamental attribution error helps us to become more aware of our own biases. So walking away again from this class, you should not fall prey to the automatic assumptions that we tend to do as humans, which is forget the background and only look at the person. But why does this happen? Why do we tend to be so mean and come for people and really just assume the worst about them and their personality? Well, it's because we are seeing others from a different perspective. When we when we look at others and their situations, we're watching them as if it's like a TV. It's that camera perspective. And so backdrop just kind of fades away and it's really the person. If you think about your favorite TV show, whether it's on TV, Netflix, Hulu, whatever it is that you watch, um, how many times can you give details about the background as compared to if you had to describe a scene and you needed to give the details about what the person was wearing, the color of the hair, that kind of stuff. So when you're watching, you're looking, you're captivated by the people. And that's what happens as compared to when you're thinking about yourself, because you are the person. You don't need to necessarily be captivated so much by yourself, but now all of your backdrop, all of your experiences, the wider context, that is looming larger, that is making more sense for you. And so this is what really happens. So I can explain myself because I can explain myself as being more than a bad person. One, not just for the sense of I gotta live with myself and so I can't actually admit that I'm bad, but two, because I also know that, I was raised in a house where there was abuse, where there was drug use, where I was kicked out at a certain age, and that I did this and that this happened. And so a series of decisions that I made were poor decisions that were really based on my experiences and the context, and not because I was a bad person just doing bad things. As compared to when I'm looking at my cousin, when I'm looking at my friend, when I'm looking at the neighbor or the stranger, and I'm literally, it's like watching TV, and I can't see all of that in the background. I may be able to see one piece of the background, and I may choose to acknowledge it, or I may just ignore it, but it's the person, and this person did it, and so that is a reflection of them. On the other hand, we make this fundamental attribution error more commonly in cultures that are individualistic because, again, it is centered on the person. When we look at the collectivist cultures, actions are made in the context of what's it's going to be in the best interest of the family, the unit, the community, whatever it is that you are identifying with. And so you are less likely to see individuals as much as seeing the unit. It's the difference for me as somebody who does therapy, who's trained in therapy, is if I have individual versus couple counseling. Individual counseling, I'm looking at the one person. Couple counseling, I can't look at any one person. I have to look at the unit because the couple itself represents something. So with fundamental attribution error, this is going to be more popular, more commonly occurring in cultures like ours that tend to be more individualistic. This example here always does a good job. This is one, it's in text, whether you are referencing the 2010 or the 2018, and it really helps to bring the pieces together. So how we explain someone's negative behavior is going to determine how we feel about it. So on the top of it, negative behavior, the man is rude to his colleague. If we attribute his rudeness as him being a hostile person, he just bitter, angry, rude, then our conclusion will be, I don't like him, and in many instances, I'm going to return the attitude. However, if we look at the green arrows down on the bottom, and we attribute this negative behavior, this attitude that we're getting because of a situation, wow, dude just got fired, and they do him wrong. They didn't give him a fair opportunity. This was not nice the way they carry him. Then now you can be more sympathetic, and in some instances where you may have even experienced it, you can even be empathetic. Okay, so our social beliefs and judgments are also going to influence how we feel and act, as we would have shown in the image before, and by so doing, they may generate their own reality. Case in point. Have you ever made a prediction about your own behavior or the outcome of a situation that came true? I can't do math. I just know I'm going to fail this class. And then let's fast forward 16 weeks later, grades are posted, and you get a D or an F. And you're like, see, I told you. I know myself. I know I can't do math. The reality is that your D may be less about your actual abilities, but more about how your expectations have influence and outcome in your life. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think many of you may have heard this term, whether you used it correctly or not. And self-fulfilling prophecies can operate in work settings, courtrooms, simulated police contacts between teens and their parents. I mean, there's a myriad of spaces. The two instances where the text goes into depth with them is experimental bias, and then in the classroom with teachers as it relates to student performance. And we do have the text is go into that so you can go through that. The other common finding we find is behavioral confirmation. And so this is in studies of social interaction is, in a nutshell, we get what we expected to get. So since we have a couple more minutes, we're not too long on this. Before we close out, let's talk a little bit about the teacher expectations and student performance. So in the classroom with teachers and student performance, what research has found, and this is sad, but it is true, is that teachers have high expectations for some students than they have for others. Now, we are not going to go into the details around that, but I will say, stick a pin, that most instances, those higher expectations for students are going to be race and class driven. So, higher expectation for a student who is lighter skinned or white as compared to a student who is darker. The same for the student who may be more financially well off as compared to the student who may be struggling financially. And I will say, even from personal experience, that I have seen this, not to the extent of the full teacher expectations and student performance, but even just walking in to a class in Claridge Primary, there was a little white girl. We were doing some testing. This was, I think, grade 2 or grade 3. One, we were all surprised that she was actually in this group because this would have been the students who were like literally not performing. And then afterwards, our like shock and surprise that she knew nothing, like could not even say her ABCs. No, this was grade 1. See, memory weak. But what stands out to me, what is salient about this memory, not necessarily what the child had on the day, how hot it was or anything, but one, that this little girl was white, had long hair, kind of plait, and two little things, cute little girl, as were a couple others, but she stood out because she was white amongst, or lighter skin, amongst just traditional black students who would be going to Claridge Primary. And that we were all shocked. Like, we literally were like, really? Like, wow, she performed that low? Because we expected it, even if she was in this group, that she would have been doing better. And so now let's take it to the next level. Teachers' high expectations seem to boost low achievers through teachers' positive attitudes. Students are sensitive to teachers' facial expressions and body movements. Teachers also offer judgments that can predict students' later performance. So, in a nutshell, the expectations that teachers have, students actually meet them, whether it is because teachers are not putting enough effort, as some research has found that they tend to not put effort if their expectations are low. They don't go into greater detail with explaining. They may use less visuals or less examples. That's one way that the students will perform lower, because they don't get the same quality of engagement. And the other side is because students may then read it and feel like there's no sense in them trying because the teacher doesn't expect more, or the teacher won't be fair. And so then they give up. So very fascinating research on this. But our expectations, we get what we are looking for. All right. That's going to be it for now, folks. What can we conclude about social beliefs and judgments? So all of these studies that this chapter have reviewed helps to inform us about our information processing powers, that they are efficient and adaptive, but we do sometimes form false beliefs. And trying hard does not eliminate biases in our thinking. Our intuition is vulnerable to misjudgment. Laboratory procedures do overestimate our intuitive powers because when we see it in real life, when we move it from the lab in real life, it just doesn't pan out the same way. False impressions, interpretations, and beliefs can produce serious consequences. And finally, heuristic snap judgments does enable efficient thinking, despite the primacy. Like it's very basic, right? There's not a lot that comes into these snap judgments. And what it really does, it aids in our survival. All right. Your responsibility to go back through if you didn't go through the text with it, but one of these concepts in here you can use to write up for your chapter 3 essay. Thank you. See you next week. So in a nutshell, when we talk about how we perceive our social worlds, you walk away, or you want to walk away, with the understanding that we respond not to reality as it is in this objective sense, but to reality as we construe it. So this means this is all about our perceptions and our interpretations of experiences. So as you may have heard before, and most times this is talked about or discussed in the context of relationships, that it's his side, her side, and the truth. Beyond the traditional relationship, it is about the fact that there is one version that belongs to one person who is a part of that experience, another version that belongs to somebody else who would have been a part of it or who would have viewed it, and then there is objective truth, and realistically we may never ever understand objective truth. The latter, of course, would exist from the perspective of maybe for those of us who are believers in Christianity, then the all-knowing God would have objective truth, but beyond that, it does not exist.